Adrenal insufficiency treatment is often described as physiologic, but for thousands of patients, that word feels like a polite fiction. You're told your labs are stable and your dose is standard, yet you're hitting a wall of fatigue every afternoon or living with a brain fog that won't clear. Why is there such a massive disconnect between the clinical success on paper and the functional struggle of real life?
It's a gap that's becoming harder to ignore, Sam. I was looking at a deep dive from my Adrenal life, and it really hits on this idea that the science is, in many ways, lagging behind the patient. We've mastered the survival part. We know how to prevent a crisis and how to replace the missing cortisol, but we're still remarkably bad at capturing what it actually feels like to live inside that treatment. It's like we've built the car and it runs, but the driver is reporting that the steering is shaky and the engine cuts out at random, and the mechanic is just looking at the fuel gauge saying, well, you have gas, so it's fine.
That's a vivid image. And when you look at the research, it's mostly built on those fuel gauge metrics, right? Lab values, mortality rates, the big, measurable emergencies.
Exactly. Research loves things it can count. It's easy to track how many people end up in the ER with an adrenal crisis. It's much harder to standardize, I feel like I'm walking through molasses today. These are what we call patient-reported outcomes, or pre-OOs. And the disconnect is stark. You can have two people with identical blood work, technically stable, where one is working a full-time job and the other can barely make it through a grocery store run without needing a 3-hour nap.
So if the labs look the same, what are we actually missing? Is it that the tests aren't sensitive enough, or are we just measuring the wrong things entirely?
It's a bit of both. Traditional labs are a snapshot, but cortisol is a movie. It's supposed to pulse. It's supposed to peak before you even open your eyes in the morning. That's the anticipatory rise. Current research is starting to admit that standard oral dosing, usually 2 or 3 times a day, just can't replicate that. A study in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism actually showed that patients on these standard regimens often have lower quality of life scores across the board compared to the general population, specifically in vitality and physical role, basically the ability to actually do things.
It's interesting you mentioned that specific study because I was reading about the ADQOL questionnaire. It's one of the few validated tools that actually asks the things like emotional regulation and fatigue specifically for Addison's. But even with tools like that, does the data actually change how a doctor treats a patient at their 15-minute checkup?
That's the friction point. Even if a doctor uses a tool like ADQL, if the research hasn't provided a dynamic dosing framework that's been proven in a controlled trial, the doctor is often stuck. They're trained on population averages, but real life is not an average. Your cortisol needs shift if you didn't sleep well, if you're stuck in traffic, or if it's 90 degrees outside. Research tends to prefer controlled environments, but patients live in the uncontrolled world. The My Adrenal Life piece points out that this creates a trial and adjust reality that the medical guidelines don't always acknowledge.
I want to push back on that trial and adjust thing for a second. If we move away from standardized protocols, don't we risk over-replacement? I mean, we know chronic over-replacement leads to things like bone loss and metabolic issues. Isn't there a reason doctors are cautious about letting patients just dose by feel?
That is the absolute heart of the tension. You're right. We have decades of data on the dangers of too much cortisol. But here's the complication. Too much might be happening at the same time as not enough. If you take a large dose at 8 a.m., you might be over-replaced at 10 a.m., but totally depleted by 4 p.m. Research published in Frontiers in Encodinology suggests that this seesaw effect, those supraphysiological peaks followed by crashes, might be exactly what's driving the poor quality of life. So, by sticking to a rigid, flatline model to avoid over-replacement, we might actually be causing a different kind of systemic stress.
So the standard might actually be the source of the instability. That's a frustrating loop to be in. If the current oral tablets can't do it, what's the next thing that research is actually working on? I saw something about pulsatility therapy.
Yes, and that's where the hope is. There's some fascinating work coming out of the University of Bristol, looking at subcutaneous pumps, similar to insulin pumps, that deliver hydrocortisone in pulses to mimic the body's natural ultradian rhythm. They're finding that when you get the timing right, patients report significant improvements in mood and cognitive function. It's proving that it's not just how much you take, but when and how it hits your system. It's moving the conversation from replacement to replication.
But a pump is a high-intervention solution. For the person listening who is struggling today, living in that gap between the research and their reality, what does this mean for their next endocrinology appointment? How do you talk about functional language when your doctor is looking at a TSH and a morning cortisol level?
That shift to functional language is crucial. Instead of saying, "I'm tired," which is vague, the recommendation is to say, "My energy drops significantly 2 hours after my second dose," or "I need 48 hours of recovery after a standard day of work." It bridges the gap because it gives the clinician a functional outcome to look at. It's acknowledging that even if the labs are stable, the life is not. And importantly, it helps the patient stop blaming themselves. If the model is built for an average person and you aren't average, that's not a failure of your body. It's a limitation of the current model.
It seems like we're in this transition period where the patients are the scouts out in the field and the research is the army slowly catching up behind them. The My Adrenal Life article mentions that your experience is not separate from the science. It's what the science is still working to understand. That's a very different way to look at a symptom that doesn't show up on a lab report.
It is. It reframes the patient from being difficult or atypical to being a vital source of data. We're seeing more studies now on things like circadian targeted therapy and long-term sleep architecture in adrenal insufficiency. We're finally admitting that not being in a crisis is a very low bar for health. The goal should be a predictable, functional life. Until the research catches up with better biomarkers, things like hair cortisol or continuous monitoring, the patient's own tracking is the most sophisticated tool we have.
It sounds like the takeaway is that if you feel there's a disconnect, you're not imagining it. You're just living in the space where the research is still evolving. We've spent a lot of time today talking about the nuances of lived experience versus clinical data, and it's clear this conversation is far from over. If this resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might be navigating that same gap. It helps to know the science is still moving, even if it feels slow from where you're standing.